Okay, so Liz, welcome to the Head Health Path podcast. It's really nice to meet you.
Hey, it's really nice to meet you, Alex.
We were just saying off air how I read one of your books that we'll be touching on today, and I found myself essentially underlining every other sentence as kind of this amazing quote that I just had to kind of remind myself of later. And I ended up highlighting half the book. But obviously, you've written more than one book, and they are essentially on the psoas, a hip flexor muscle, and you have decades worth of experience working with this in what, for me, at least from my perspective, quite a unique way. So before we dive into your work on the psoas, are you happy just to share a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. Um, I come into the somatic world or the sensory world or the physical world in many ways as a conceptual artist. So I'm not a therapist. And I think that's important that I don't have any training in that. I came to the work that I do through my personal explorations as a conceptual artist because I was interested in perception and how life is shaped by how we perceive it, how I'm shaped by how I perceive myself. So that was really kind of the entrance point, and I happened to realize how much movement plays a part in in my perception. So my history is, I have scoliosis, kyphosis, lordosis. At least I did or have had. Um, and I kiddingly say probably psychosis, but I've never been I've never been actually analyzed about that. But the point being is that I didn't think that my organism was going to change. I was just doing whatever I was doing in a creative way because I recognized that there was something very soulful and very important in what I was exploring through the perceptual and conceptual concepts that I was playing with. But movement plays a part in that. And so I, at one point, looked for somebody to work with in movement. And in those days, many years ago, there were things like classes called human potential, in which you explored literally the sensory world. And I entered that with a man named Bob Cooley, who was the teacher, who came from a dance background, looking at injuries and why do we injure ourselves? Or what does it really mean to have an injury, say in the ankle, and how he recognized it really came from the very core of our being. So much of movement is an expression of the literal core of your being. And he was who introduced me to the psoas. And so when I would go into constructive rest on my back, knees up, feet on the floor, which is a way of landing, but also a way of allowing gravity to release extraneous tension in your psoas, I found myself shaking and reacting and having all these like responses of wanting to jump up and run away. And I didn't understand what was happening and why, but I knew that something was happening. So my attention started to see if I could play a game with myself and catch the moment I kept fleeing. And what was that about? And when I slowed my system, my awareness down to where I could actually start to feel, I recognized I was terrified. And yet looking around the room, there wasn't anything that was, about to eat me or and so that made me very curious. And that was kind of my way of going on with psoas. It just fascinated me. It fascinated me that this core of my own being had so many expressions that I had never explored, that I had somehow been frozen in a way, you could say. And in the trauma world now, we use that word being in flight or being in fight or being in freeze. And so I wasn't interested in that per se, but I was interested in how do I return to something that really allows me to be a creative, expressive human being.
Beautiful. And I'm hoping I've got your book open at the right page, because there's a quote which is just as a 360-degree directional receiver, transmitter, and inner communicator. And I guess that kind of is what you've been saying there ultimately. There's huge wisdom there that we can access if we understand how ultimately. But I also think we should probably take a step back, because there might be some listeners who are going, what on earth is the psoas? Um,
Right.
so yeah, kind of just going back to basics very briefly. Do you want to just touch on a little bit of the bog standard content that people might find about the psoas?
Okay, so you mentioned that it was a hip flexor. Okay, and that is the biomechanical interpretation, I will say, of anatomy, which is cadavers, which are dead. So we're looking at tissue that is dead and defining it and defining what its movement might be. And the mechanical model, even in exercise, looks at psoas as a muscle that goes from the spine to the legs and is very large, about the size of your fist, and basically is often engaged in some kind of core strength or in what you would think of as a hip flexor. And and so it goes from the basically like your diaphragm area into your legs, into the top of the femurs. So it's triangular. It's from the spine to the legs, so it goes slightly forward. And in doing so, it's considered a flexor because in the biomechanical world, all tissue from spine forward flexes and all tissue from spine back extends. If you change the paradigm, which is what I'm doing in that book and have done in my other books, and go to an embryological model of how the organism grows as a living system, then you understand that psoas is emerging out of what we call, or what is called, the primitive streak, the midline, the axis of your being, and how the cells organize around that axis as you emerge as a fetus. And so that central channel, as it's called in things like Chinese medicine, is a field of energy, what I call biointelligence, which is really shaping us. Psoas grows out of that. So I began to understand psoas not as this thing, not as this mechanical mover, lever idea, but as literally a communicator from the very center of your being. And in embryology, there's a soul to the being. In biomechanics, there isn't. There's no, where's the, so you ask a biomechanic, where's your soul? Even your doctor, right? And they'll say, I think you need to go speak to someone else. Um, so we are compartmentalized in that old model. And so the new model is whole because it's whole expression. It's all of you. It's how you come into the world, how you experience the world. So as messenger, um, in the new model of even um, anatomy, which is looking at fluid tissue, looking at what we call connective tissue, is a matrix. And it's in the deepest core of your being. And in that deepest bag of bags of connective tissue, if you think of yourself as this kind of portal in which there's, layers to you, in the very deepest part of yourself is your central nervous system, your psoas, your kidneys, and your adrenals. As a physician, that's all about survival, but it's also about health and
Yeah,
vitality.
absolutely. And I think you mentioned how it's often referred to as, is it the muscle of the soul?
In
Uh,
Taoist healing, they call it the muscle of the soul. Yes.
yeah.
And I think that's, I'd get rid of the muscle, but in the myofascial world, it's called the neurocore. And so it has qualities of muscle, and you can engage it as a muscle. But if you allow it to be more this neurological uh, rooting system into the earth, then you actually are kind of more nourished on the very core of your being rather than constricted and kind of holding on for dear life. So that's the shift that I find really allows psoas to be what it is, which is filet mignon. It's the juiciest cut of meat if we eat animals. It's because it's orbital. It's non-directional. It doesn't have fibers that define its movement. It's picking up a larger field, back body, side body, top body. It's picking up all. So in that orbital quality, it's so tender, so juicy, so delicate. But if I use it as a cable, if I recruit it as this, like, how I'm going to hold myself together, not only do I change the quality of this tissue and lose some of its receptivity and expression, but I also change the organ functioning. So gut health changes, kidney energy changes because it starts to get dry and hard, and it changes the whole ecosystem of the internal fluids of your being.
Fascinating. It's a kind of it's a similar theme in some sense. I've had a couple of conversations on the podcast where we talk about, health being, you can almost feel it. There's a sense of abundance and expansion and fluidity and freedom compared to dis-ease, which as you say, drier, constriction, fragmented. And it's such a hard thing, at least for me, to articulate because it's a felt thing, I think,
It is
ultimately.
a felt sense. It is a felt sense. I mean, I can say that an orthopedic surgeon actually reached out to me and told me he sees more and more dry psoas. So when he's repairing or he's trying to reconstruct a spine that's been injured or, diseased, or he's actually seeing dry psoas. And I said, I can see it from the outside. I don't have to, do surgery. And I said, so you're really looking at drying connective tissue. You're looking at how the whole matrix of the organism has gone from that plush little baby, that's so buoyant and so fluid, to dryness. And we often think, well, that's common because that's aging. But I don't think so. I think that we don't want to confuse aging, which we all will do, to drying out, because we can dry out very young. And some of it is the stricture that we put upon the core. So even some of the fitness, exercise strategies for being strong, I think are inaccurate. They're built on an old model of shoring up the system and creating density rather than creating connectivity. And fluid is the best source of neurological connectivity.
Mm.
It's a conduit for electrical impulses. So it means your cells and your tissue is thriving in that, but also flowing like a river. So I often think of the center of the being or the spine not as a column, but as a living river. And so we can do restorative work that begins, which is what you're doing. You're doing restorative work when you're looking at the gut biome.
Right. Yeah. And I think I like that idea of kind of often thinking about it as restorative. And the question that's coming to mind is if these sort of tissues are sort of drying out, and we can see that maybe sort of visually, or you can see that maybe in other ways as well. What are some of the ways that we can restore, and what are some of the things that dry out, I guess, at the same time?
Yeah. Well, drying out can come from ergonomics. That the shoe you put on a young child changes the way they move from their core, because movement is a core base. We're a spine based organism, so all movement comes from the spine. But say I wear a shoe that's very stiff, very heavy, and I'm not saying a work shoe that you're using specifically for doing an activity. I'm talking about like every day, or putting that on a young child. You will literally see them change from falling from a kind of fluid, playful place to having to use this muscle activity. So then the legs are carrying the spine. So returning to core-based movement is important, where you're not stabilizing the core, you're actually expressing from the core. So expression can be anything from what I say, my voice, to my feelings. But we learn to, in the modernity, that it's considered um, a training of behavior to stop emotional expression, and that is to the detriment of the core of our being. I'm not saying we don't know. We could look at, how do I express myself and what are the best ways to get my communication across. But when we use fear is what Psoas is reading. So am I safe? Am I not safe? So the emotional aspects of Psoas are very based in early patterning, early ways of being uh, received or rejected, or so you can see there's a whole emotional expression of fear, as well as the animal body's response to shock or fear, or something falling. But in that, there's actually movement. So people will say, "Gee, I fell out of a tree. I was climbing a tree and I fell, but I rolled." Those are expressions of psoas. Psoas curls you up. It makes you bigger. Think of how the river or an animal in protection will either get bigger, that's called warding off, or just standing your ground, or rolling, or running away, or jumping up. And when we stop all those expressions and think we need to control our emotions, we also use the psoas to recruit it to change the diaphragm, to feel less, to sense less. And we see a lot of people have difficulty sensing themselves. So there's shock in the body, and the shock in the body can go all the way back to their birth story,
Mm.
as well as all the things that happen to us. And because we don't have these restorative gestures that allow us to recover from the freeze, to as an animal who's frozen in the bunny frozen in the meadow is when they see, feel, hear the fox, and then runs quickly. They have a way of expressing that. Human civilization has controlled, especially the Western colonized concepts of controlling humanity, is about not expressing yourself, is to shut it down. So we see that over time drying us. And some of it, the third piece, is actually performative behavior. In other words, dance is often taught to engage the psoas because it's about control. So there's I would say, almost a militaristic way of controlling ourselves to articulate certain movements that imitate something. It's not about my expression, it's about something I'm repeating or
Mm.
doing to perform. So the performative piece is partly behavior and partly cultural. And so you see a difference in the way the spine is expresses itself. And one of the ways for people to really just kind of get a picture of this is if you look at human beings from the northern hemisphere who have been born and grown in the northern hemisphere in a more Western modern society versus any indigenous or uh, uh, ethnicity, or actually just southern hemisphere where you're closer to water, and you will see those river-like fluids in the spine itself. They haven't been lost.
Mm.
So if you watch African dance, if you watch movement, that spine is the same spine. What happened? Why is it rigid one place and moving like a river the other? That's a cultural inhibition that has either supported and thrived or lost its ability to express. So
Mm.
there's a big cultural piece that we have to look at.
Yeah. And I think that concept around sort of communication and expression is
Behavior.
such a big one. And certainly from a personal journey perspective, I've become more and more aware of how my capacity to communicate, whether that's with Katie, my wife, family, colleagues, clients, it has a huge ripple effect into how I'm in this world ultimately. So yeah, I can totally relate to that.
Yeah. So we can look at restorative gestures as being one, hydrating, like not only drinking water, which hydrates, but really, if you're really dry, it kind of just you end up peeing a lot, right? You don't actually absorb. So
Mm.
what creates absorption is what's called micro movements. Like, and so you could look at breath as being a place to play, sound, singing, humming, being a place to start hydrating, moving these little subtle ways. Like I tell people, if you're in a shower, you could wrap your arms around you and let the water for a few seconds roll down your back, but move your spine to that. Let the spine receive that water through movement. Or in a bathtub where you're soaking maybe in mineral salts, where you start playing with an idea of tongue to tail, that your spine is actually a fish, because bone evolved out of water, just as it evolved in the fluids of your mother's womb. It is an oceanic origins. And so when you do anything that allows the spine to start remembering, and really from a functional point of view, these are normal spinal movements. It should flex, extend, rotate, articulate, and bend. I mean, that's spinal movement. So the two fit together. It's that we're just not used to thinking that that is okay, or that it's too sexual, or that it's somehow, because we've been inhibited to not express the core. So then we come up with, again, whatever your background is, and the way in which you've been shaped by your environment.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. Something I've been sort of reflecting on a lot recently is how I feel there's often an explanation on at many layers on the same thing. So, you come up with the physical, biomechanical sort of explanation, but there could be an emotional, a psychological, and I'll just call it the spiritual or energetic sort of element as well. And they're all true to some degree. It's finding which is, I guess, the core truth maybe in that one individual when you're on the topic.
Well, it also feels like it's an interplay between all of them, because part of the idea of reductionist thinking, which is what anatomy is based on and medicine is based on in terms of traditional Western medicine, allopathic medicine, is that it is compartmentalized. You go to a psychologist to work with your emotions, you go to the physical doctor for your physical ailment, you go to your spiritual teacher or church or synagogue or mosque to handle your spiritual. That is, in reductionist thinking, the idea of compartmentalization. We have compartmentalized the human being and put them. So when I tell people about Psoas, I say, when they were looking at the cadavers were dry in the beginning of anatomy, they put the Psoas in the muscle box, okay, because it was the closest thing that would be. But if you talk to a butcher about filet mignon, they'll say it's different than any other tissue of an animal. It's very unique. And so really, I think it's kind of like an organ of perception. It's not specifically an organ, but if we thought of it like the tongue, the tongue is a sensory organ, right? It's a lot about expression, where your psoas moving down into rooting you into the earth is also. And when we're listening to it, we start to, what I say, develop a level of core awareness, where we're actually noticing, how do I feel? How do I sense that? So a beautiful example of the relationship between the gut and the psoas is that when my gut is upset, when there's something out of balance in my gut, maybe it's what I ate, maybe whatever it is, whatever has caused a kind of intestinal or stomach, because it's that in embryology, that's the primal tube, right? And it's enfolded into this core. When it starts talking to me, that bacteria starts telling my brain things and starts communicating, my psoas goes on alert. It's like, okay, there's something, like I'm incoherent in a way. So when we bring all these pieces together, how do I feel? What is my energetic? It's actually, energy work is one of the best ways to work with the psoas, because the further away, the better. Psoas doesn't like to be manipulated. If you go in and poke it, it's like the caterpillar. It's going to have a reaction. It's not going to actually make, if you kept poking the caterpillar, it doesn't make a healthier caterpillar. It doesn't actually, but clearing those fields, allowing the system to not be burdened by, whatever it is. All of that, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's actually not where the problem is. It's often doing all of that. Yeah, I take that approach. I'm working, like, all of a sudden, oh, okay, I'm getting this message that something is not okay. And something, in some ways, I'm not safe, in the sense that I'm not totally grounded, coherent. You could say I'm not in my parasympathetic nervous system. I'm not able, and it's in the parasympathetic where rest, digest, and repair happens. That's where restorative gestures are. That's where we reclaim ourselves. It's where we find innovating ideas of, oh, what if I eat this food instead of that food? Or what if I take more walks? Or what if all of a sudden this kind of longing to, show up comes from the very core of your being
Mm,
on
amazing.
all the levels.
Yeah, that kind of just deep wisdom in the body that I think
Yeah.
is becoming more accepted, and from the general public perspective, they're becoming more aware of, with more practitioners coming out with similar messages to yours in regards to this kind of somatic side to therapy ultimately.
Yes. Yes. And I think the piece that can be really useful is that anyone can do this, whether you have a guide or you don't have a guide. All you have to do is get on the floor, you know, um, get in constructive rest. And constructive rest has such value. It's such a simple thing to do. So, for example, people, if you come home from work or you stop working at home, to take a few moments every day for a while, just to kind of tune in and get on the floor on, something that's going to make your bones feel comfortable, but that you can feel you're literally landed on something solid. Um, and, knees up, feet on the floor. And bring your feet in relationship to your hip sockets. That's more towards the center, not the outside of your. So you're not in a straddle. You're in a comfortable position. And if you need something, put it between the knees, and simply rest there for maybe 5 minutes. And what you might notice is how uncomfortable you are. You might notice, like I did, all kinds of like, oh my God, get me out of here. It's time to go do dinner or, do something else. You realize how fast paced you're moving. So it's the slowing down that's so valuable for tuning in. That's how we tune into the senses. And as we start to tune into how does my bones land, what am I actually feeling, what is happening, can I sense my feet, or do I need a little maybe sandbags on my feet to find my feet again, to root, to actually find my spine to ground rooting. When I finish there, take your glasses off, you wear glasses. When you finish there in that 3 to 5 minutes for the beginning, roll to your side and just rest there for a moment to see how you feel. And then get up and move around and notice if that changes the way you digest your dinner. You know, how you feel in relationship to who you're having dinner with.
Mm,
All of a sudden you're more present in this moment.
yeah, beautiful. And it
And
is.
gravity is doing the work, so there's no work. Gravity is releasing. In other words, when I'm in my bones, gravity allows the psoas lets go of any of its tension patterns. So it just simply doesn't need to be released. It just needs to be able to find ground, find bone. Bone is really what it's communicating a lot. Am I in my bones? Because bones vibrate at a much slower vibration than electronics do.
Okay, interesting. And on the topic of like hydration as being sort of a core sort of element of this, are you familiar with Dr. Gerald Pollack at all in his work?
I've heard his name and I don't know his work.
So he talks about he's come up with this term of EZ water, or the exclusion zone. So to cut a long story short, he talks about how 90% of our molecules in the body are water. So we are 90% water ultimately, and this EZ water is a very unique structure. It's not actually H2O. I think it's H2O3 is the structure that he's found, and he talks about how that is one of the most important things from a cellular function, cellular communication sort of perspective. And he talks about how movement, but also light, has a role to play within creating this specific type of water. I think you'd find it really interesting, and I imagine there would be some overlaps with
Great.
your kind of
I'll
what
look
we've
it
been
up.
sharing as well. Yeah, I think you'll find it really interesting. Um, and then the micro movements, just kind of going back to this. So again, I imagine this is a very just simple strategy that we can do pretty much anytime, anywhere as well.
Well, yeah, and I think that at first, when you're very dry, the idea of micro movements are like impossible to even imagine, right? There's a kind of it's like a dry sponge. You know, you find the dry sponge under your sink that's been there for a year in the back, and it's like so hard and so rigid. And if you just pour water over it, it doesn't necessarily plump up, right?
Right.
You actually have to kind of make these little wave motions or squeezes, right? And start to get some movement. So that's where you begin. And certainly, you can do that in water, like I said, in a bathtub. You know, that's one way. But you can also do it. I use simple things. I mean, simple things like tiny little rocks, little wave motions, getting the spine to move, not the head moving or the legs moving, but the actual spine. And one of the ways I like to do it is with an inflatable ball. I get a ball that's very gushy, like a children's ball that you can be taken in and up through blowing it up, and bringing it way down and just putting it for the psoas. I start right at the psoas in the back or the back of the heart, and just slowly go up and down the spine. And I have a video on my website that demonstrates me doing it years ago. And you can see I'm almost not moving, you know, but I'm just doing these tiny. So after constructive rest, for example, taking a moment or two to land, putting a ball like that along your spine, going all the way down to your tail and all the way up to your axis, and you know, maybe the back of the head, it starts to actually message the spine. And you're doing, and what happens is you land on this ball, and the idea is that as I land on it, I'm really falling into it. I'm allowing it to hold me. And in that, the ball will move a little bit. That's the micro movement. I don't even have to do anything. I just let the ball move me. So the more I don't try, the better micro movements show up. But once you get them going, there's literally a wave motion that goes through the spine. There's literally that fish kind of quality of lateral movement going through the spine that we rarely see in our spines, is the ability for it to actually move in a lateral fish movement. You see it in dance and, you know, Fiji and Bali, and, you know, you see that lateral fish expression because it's part of their tradition. Mm-hmm. But we don't, you know, in the Western world. So regaining that, and it's tiny, so it's not something big you have to do. It's very subtle. It's actually the smaller. So here's the premise of hydration: less is more, which means don't keep doing it. Just move to each one. Just a little bit does enough. Lightening up, meaning less pressure. So you're not pushing on a ball, or you're not trying to get something to happen. You're backing off. That's that volume you're talking about, that internal volume. That's so needed. So I call it lofting. Like if you had a down comforter and you shook it hard, it would all gather and clump. But if you kind of loft it by a wave, bigger wave, like all of a sudden the down is everywhere, that's what we're looking for. We're looking to loft the connective tissue, and slowing way down. So it's just a little bit, but slow, and just a very light touch is actually what opens the organism up, not the pressure or push or ironing or pressing. And there is a technique called melt method that a neuromyofascial therapist developed that works just on hands and feet. So if you're too tender along your midline, your spine feels really dry or really in pain, because one of what pain is connective tissue collapse. So it's that dryness, and now it's entrapping the nerves. So to open it up, you can actually begin with and you can go to a YouTube's channel and learn how to do it with a little ball, like a squash ball, like a little squash ball, your hands and your feet, and start there, so that you're working further away from where your injury or tension is, and starting to nourish the system with this idea. And I'm amazed how quickly people start to respond to this by simply rolling over and getting up and going, wow, I feel so much, I just feel more relaxed.
Brilliant. Before I forget, I will put the video that you mentioned that's on your website into the show notes so people can access it nice and easily. And the thing that I'm going to try and articulate that was coming up for me when you were describing that exercise is that I think, there's a consensus that the body stores information, let's just call it that, memory, information, energy. And if we're able to improve communication at a cellular level or between cells, it's allowing for better flow of information and energy, and um, we're becoming more synergistic, we're becoming more whole again. Would you agree if that makes
Oh,
sense?
absolutely. That's a beautiful way of putting it because you're really looking at stagnation. Dryness is stagnation. So we say, well, let go of something, let go of your tension, but people are like, how do I do that? Whereas hydration, it's not really, I'm trying to get rid of something. I'm actually nourishing the system, and it will, through the flows, eliminate as well as receive nourishment.
Mm,
So the reparative is the fact that we are innovative organisms. We're constantly recreating ourselves, right? Cells are sloughing off, new cells are appearing. You have the potential, and I know I certainly, who I was in that description of that young woman who was so terrified, I'm not that person, and my spine is resilient, and so in my elder years, I actually don't have any of the pains or aches that I had in my 20s. They're gone. Over time, my organism got healthier and healthier and healthier. So whatever was the beginning years of my life were able to be uh, metabolized. And so to me, integration is about uh, the metabolic process.
mm,
And that's what's so beautiful about your work and my work is I'm doing the same thing on a metabolic movement level
right.
of that ability to then take those substances and actually be able to utilize them. And
Yeah.
there's a piece here that's so emotional to me because the organism is a longing organism. Like, if you look at embryology, when the cell splits, the center, literally longs to root into the mother's womb. We long to show up here on earth, and our gut philia, right? If it's sticky and stuff, it can't like long to take those nutrients in. Like all the expressions of the core is about receiving and letting go. So the what's called in embryology infolding and unfolding, whether that's a cellular level or a tissue level or an organ level or an emotional level or an energetic level. It's like there's this way. And to me, what comes out of that is a kind of creative capacity that is where it goes back to uh, my interest in conceptual art, which is play, which is how do I play? How do I allow myself to flourish, or blossom in my life? And it is through play. So these different ways of little subtle movements allow us to kind of reappear again in a new way.
Yeah. And it reminds me of that kind of, as you say, going from a cellular to a whole, there's just this kind of ripple effect and the same message, just at different levels of existence or whatever, however you want to describe it. Um, and there's that just beautiful mystical nature to it that we've got to bring into the science domain, which, as you said earlier, has kind of been very reductionistic. And now we have these silos. It's kind of bringing it all back together again.
It is, and I do feel like the physicists and the biologists are our new mystics because they're telling us the same story.
Yeah.
It's really, the person on the ground, so to speak, who is trained a certain way in school or in their family that hasn't caught up to what the possibilities are or who have been closed down around who they truly are. And you have a young baby, you watch that being, and it's like they're curious, right? They're,
Oh,
they're
yeah.
yeah, and that's what an adult is too. Like, where did our curiosity go? Where did our play go?
Yeah.
It dried up. It's like the well dried up, right? And so now we're saying, well, when the rain's a certain way, I tell this story because I found it so profound when I experienced it. I lived in the redwood forest. That's where I raised my three children. And and when it rained in a certain way, and it wasn't just every time it rained, it was like in a certain way, it would activate underground springs that would literally pop up in all these random places. Like you don't even realize how many rivers are underneath, the redwoods, right? And all of a sudden these springs are coming up. And I really saw that as that potential. Like when we're playing this way, we can think, well, I don't know if this is doing anything, but on all of a sudden, there's a kind of a gestalt, something changes, and there's this like spring in your step, or there's this creative idea of what you want to do, or you realize, boy, I haven't had a backache for weeks, or my stomach hasn't, irritated. Like all of a sudden, something has really shifted.
Mm.
And you don't know when that moment will be.
Yeah. Amazing. And I think, you mentioned the connection between the psoas and the diaphragm. So is there anything that we can sort of expand on from a breathing perspective, and how that kind of, I imagine, connects into this somehow?
I prefer sounds,
Okay.
because there isn't that kind of top down motto as I'm going to breathe right. Because in reality, the organism doesn't breathe, it is breathed.
Mm.
We are breathed. We're a living being. Okay. So we don't have to like breathe, and I mean, a lot of the strategies are recognizing that I'm holding my breath. So one of the best things to do is make a sound that's a long exhale, whether that's a sh or a ah or a oh or just the long exhale. And when you make sound, you vibrate cells, you vibrate tissue. So sounding and playing with sound, singing, humming, and long exhales, your organism will start to kind of come back into its capacity to let go and also receive. And the relationship of psoas to diaphragm is an interesting one, because it is the upper psoas is a lot of where we learn strategies for survival. If someone tells you to stop crying and stop crying now, or I'll give you something to cry about, and threatens you, how does a child do that? How do we stop our emotions? We do it by, I think, unconsciously feeling unsafe and engaging the psoas, like, like something's about to happen. How do I do this? There's panic. And over time, what we've done is we've engaged that psoas kind of holding. It pushes the diaphragm slightly forward, and that esophagus going through the diaphragm, it has everything to do with digestion, is now constrained. And the aorta behind it is being kind of closed off, like clipped off. So what do? We have less oxygen, and we have less blood circulation, and we have less emotions.
Hmm.
And therefore we don't, or less sensation, you could say, and then that way we have less emotions. So we've kind of shut ourselves off right at that upper psoas, and that's why we have so much digestive, because there's so much fear in people in response to, am I doing this right? Am I okay? How do I control myself to be loved or approved of or received or accepted? So there's so much manipulation there, either intentionally as a way of controlling, which there is a kind of a power to controlling your feelings. We see that in the military. That's how we train someone to be able to kill someone else, is through not having any emotion about it. So but it shows up also in different fitness strategies. This is powering over. It plays. But if I let that go, the first thing I feel is how vulnerable I am. We all are vulnerable as human beings. The power lies in grounding that, so that I actually can be responsive. It's not so much either I'm powerful or I'm vulnerable. It's, am I rooted here in this moment so I can be responsive to this moment? Can I show up and actually have a what I call core integrity of what is truly, what am I receiving here, and how do I get some choices. So along with getting better digestion and better blood flow, you also get more creative in, how do I want to work with things that scare me? How do I want to work with times when I feel overwhelmed? How do I do that without shutting my system down? Right. And it's not that turning inward and going into a collapse is bad. I actually speak about that because that's also, we're supposed to never do that. We're supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstrap, right? But that kind of tension in the gut is I think, tumultuous and doesn't really allow all the beings of my gut, all the bacteria of my gut to flourish, and send correct messages and to my brain, So it's a kind of whole kinship here in terms of as an organism. We have what, more bacteria than we have human cells.
Yeah.
So, it's a cooperative event here. And one of the ways to be cooperative is to not be holding my breath, but to allow the exhale. And when I play with long, long, long exhales, I'm amazed at how there's a pause. It's not a fear. There's actually a pause between breaths in which the organism then starts to show up as a much fuller, more abdominal breath.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I like sound to make it short.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant.
Yeah, because it's playful. It's playful. It's not trying to control it. It's a way to play with tissue.
Yeah. And I've been doing that, sort of putting Oscar to bed in the evenings. I've been finding that long hums, I'm convinced, makes a huge difference to him just falling asleep like a baby.
Yes, that's beautiful. And what you're doing as a papa is you're co-regulating. So co-regulating is part of, the polyvagal system, and which has everything to also to do with digestion, because the vagus nerve goes down into the psoas digestive connection. But one of the things is the more you can regulate your system, what you're doing then for that mammal baby, because babies don't regulate themselves. So putting a baby, isolating a baby, putting it in a separate room, crying it out, whatever, all the strategies that people have tried to teach sleep patterns is actually not what mammals do. Mammals regulate. They either are on a body that is regulating, or you're regulating through sound, possibly, but you're changing the vibrational field in your system, and he is regulating to you. And that allows him a deep rest.
Yeah, it definitely works. I'm convinced.
Yeah, well, it does. That's what mammals do. Mama bear sees baby flailing, comes over, grabs baby, puts baby to body.
Yeah.
That is regulation. We are co-regulating organism. We do not regulate on ourselves. We grow in our capacity to hold that regulation, and in so doing can be apparent to another unregulated nervous system.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can see how regulated your nervous system is by hanging out with your baby. Because if you're not very regulated, that baby is going to drive you like, you don't know, you need a mama bear, you need somebody to regulate with. And I would say for anybody who doesn't have someone to regulate with, nature is our great mother regulator. So literally putting your belly to a tree, your body to the ground, on good weather, putting your, literally doing constructive rest on the ground, in grass, or literally sitting next to a river and listening to that murmuring of the river, right? Which is what you're doing. You're creating a murmuring in which your baby is resonating with.
Yeah.
So Mother Nature can be our great regulator.
Yes, absolutely. And it reminds me of those images that I've seen of researchers who have looked at the actual structure of cells after sound, for example, or looking at water molecules after prayer, and seeing how there's that synchronicity and there's that sort of, or just obvious structure as a result.
Yes, you see the difference between the incoherent and the coherent, because coherent usually has beautiful mathematical, what we call biomorphic structure, geometrical structures that show up in nature over and over again, and is part of who we are and part of what all life is.
Yeah, it kind of blows your mind. It shows you how many options are out there. I think that's the great thing about this. There are so many different ways to go about improving some of these things. So hopefully it's empowering rather than necessarily overwhelming as well.
Well, yeah, I think that people are looking outside for all the answers, but and support from the outside is part of that regulation, right? It is
Mhm.
community, and it is someone who's focused on an expertise that can kind of see the pattern that's going on or recognize something about you. But it's also this journey inward of trusting that actually you know things because you carry the lineage of that cell, millions of years. You're a, million billion year old organism, you could say.
Yeah.
You're elemental, and the elements reveal themselves and they inform us. And so the ability to turn towards and sense into is about self-actualization, about the ability to actually kind of utilize the knowledge that we might receive from outside rather than thinking somebody else has the answer for me,
Mhm.
because then it can resonate in you whether this, and sometimes I know when we're really off balance, we really need somebody else to kind of hold us in that being off balance to where we can start to regulate. But again, it's the parasympathetic where repair happens. And I tell people if you're in a strong sympathetic response, you're in a fight or flight freeze response, your injury or whatever illness you have can't repair because it only happens in this soft rhythm. So whether that's using sound, to allow your nervous system or energy work or nutritional support, or it's really a kind of caring for yourself. It's a self-care practice. It's not a taking your car in for repairs and somebody else is going to fix it. You're going to come back and drive your car.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I
And
see.
it's play.
Yes, I think that's such a big one. I think one of the things I see, at least in my area of helping people, is there's definitely a lack of sort of joy, a lack of play, a lack of actual self-care, even though we think we're doing things that might fall under the umbrella of self-care. A lot of it's kind of deprivation and what food do I need to avoid to get well? There's a lot of kind of what do I need to take away rather than necessarily what can I add and what can I experience and sense, etc. And it's really interesting to kind of see that paradigm.
Yes, yes. And I think that's a very strong cultural uh, kind of container we're in. You know,
Okay.
is that there is a way to fix the problem, and I become the problem.
Mm,
Okay, and then it's like I treat myself that way. How do I fix this problem? I am a problem. You know?
yeah.
But if I recognize I'm a living organism and I need that love and quality of attention that maybe I never got, deprivation might have been what all I know. So how do I start to add these pieces that listen to what do I long for? I really use that as an impulse for people is what do you long for? And if you track that in yourself, you'll begin to find the ways that you come back into relationship with life. Life that's bigger than you are. Life is literally the living earth. There's a whole way of being supported. Not as a human being, we're so out of kinship with all life. We don't see life as alive,
Mm.
and so it's very easy to start being very mechanistic with ourselves and have a checklist and try to do it from the top down. But if we do it from the heart and the gut and the psoas, and the bones, it, you start getting. I mean, I've literally had dreams. One time I had a dream. I woke up and the dream said I need boron. And I didn't even know what it was. It's like I don't even know what this dream means. I had to go find out, research. What is boron? I mean, it just came up. I'd never heard the word. It was like I don't even know where. I mean, it's amazing how you people call it intuition, but I actually think it's the body speaking. It's the language of body.
Mm. Beautiful. Liz, I could talk to you all day, but I'm I'm very mindful of time. Um, is there anything that you want to kind of conclude with or sort of emphasize before we close?
Well, I would say, that one of the things we know about mammals for health and vitality is uh, the ability to play. That's actually survival is based on the capacity to play. And part of it has to do with how play changes the way we see and perceive and think and solve problems and gather together and find community. And so even if it's small ways, even if we feel like, I think the culture says you don't get to play until you've done your homework, you don't get to play until your work is finished. And I think that's a mistake. I think that is a consumeristic, capitalistic kind of uh, bitter pill to have swallowed. And not that bitter isn't good, because bitter is really good. Maybe it's sweet. Maybe it's too sweet. I don't know. But just to say that recognizing that play is the way I heal, even if it's ways that just, I'm in bed and I can't move, but I can make a sound, and I start making sounds, and maybe it'll turn into a song. I don't know, or swear words, or I don't know what it'll show up as. But
Yeah.
or wiggling your toes, wiggling your fingers. It's like these ways that literally bone tapping, or what I call hugging. Getting to know bone is one of the ways we land here. And when we can land here, we can kind of look around and we're not so panicked.
Mm.
Psoas comes down to land in ground. Oh, I'm here. This is the moment where I am. And when I'm in this moment, I can actually respond to this moment.
Beautiful. I love that conclusion. And I think it brings up a lot of what we've spoken about today, really. You talking about wiggling toes and fingers gets me thinking about reawakening the body and connecting to the body and getting that communication going again and all of these things.
Yes.
So yeah, I think we can all take something from that, no matter where we are within our health journey. As
Yes.
you've just shown us how simple it can be to start with, if it needs to be.
Yes.
So Liz, thank you so much for
Yeah.
sparing the time. It's been a real privilege to speak with you. And if you're ever back in the UK, I'll certainly be keeping an eye out for any workshops or anything like this that are going on.
Oh, I certainly hope I get to come back to the UK. I've spent 20 years teaching there, and I adore the UK, the people, and my cup of tea, and my scones, and yeah.
Perfect. I guess actually just to finish with Liz, where can people find you if they want to learn a little bit more about you or your work? Where's best to go?
My website has a deep dive. I've been doing this kind of work for 45 years, and although the internet hasn't existed that long, a lot of things that were published, and they're timeless. So go on coreawareness.com and scroll if you want to. Like, it's like, people say, wow, there's so much here. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see educational resources. You can begin with some articles that were published in Positive Health, as a UK magazine that was around for many years and then went online. But there's simple articles, there's those videos, there's other interviews, so that's a good place to just kind of settle in with a cup of tea and, read something about one article that kind of gives you an overview of the psoas, or one video, and you go, oh, I think I might, play with buoyancy. What is it to not only land in my bones, but now feel the buoyancy of gravity back up through my bones, and then play with that and just kind of take it in bite size,
Yeah,
and metabolize it, chew it up and taste it, and, feel the texture of it, and literally allow it to kind of simmer inside of you and see what it does.
amazing. Excellent. Liz, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll connect again soon.
Thank you, Alex. It was great to be with you.